The silence of the Arizona prairie was a liar. It promised peace, but held its breath waiting for the crack of a rifle or the cry of a hawk. For Martha Hemlock, a widow with hands as cracked as the baked earth she worked, that silence was a shroud for the memory of her husband's last, rattling breath. She lived by the rhythms of the sun and the needs of her young son, Caleb. But one sweltering afternoon, a sound broke the stillness, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was a human cough, weak and ragged from behind her barn. In that moment, Martha faced a choice that would pit her against everything she knew, forcing her to decide between the town's law and a stranger's life. The heat of late August in Redemption Gulch was a physical presence, a weight that settled on the shoulders and stole the air from one's lungs. It shimmered above the parched soil of Martha Hemlock's farm, making the distant mesas wobble like a drunkard's dream. For 2 years since the fever had taken her, Elias, this heat, and the silence had been her only constant companions. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her homestead, a sturdy but unpainted clapboard house, a leaning barn that smelled of dry hay and ghosts, and a vegetable patch that took more sweat than it gave sustenance. And of course there was Caleb. Caleb, at 7 years old, was a small, wiry echo of his father, with the same unruly shock of sandy hair and eyes the color of a faded blue sky. He was the reason Martha rose before the sun and collapsed into her corn husk mattress long after it had set. He was the anchor that kept her from floating away on the vast, lonely sea of the territory. On this particular afternoon, the air was so still that the buzzing of a horsefly against the window pane sounded like a buzz saw. Martha was mending one of Caleb's shirts on the porch, her needle moving with a practiced weary rhythm. Caleb was chasing grasshoppers near the well, his laughter a rare and precious sound that she treasured like water. The town, a good 2-mile walk away, felt like another country. Here there was only the sun, the dust, and the work. That was when she heard it. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the drone of the insects. A dry, hacking sound. A cough. It came from the far side of the barn, the side that faced the open, unforgiving expanse of the scrubland. Martha froze her needle hovering over the worn fabric. Her heart began a frantic, heavy beat against her ribs. No one ever came out this way. The track to her farm was barely visible, and her nearest neighbor was a sour old prospector named Peterson, who kept to himself 3 miles down the creek. Travelers stuck to the main trail, and folks from town had no reason to visit a widow who kept her accounts paid and her head down. Caleb hadn't heard it. He was now trying to coax a lizard out from under a rock, completely absorbed in his small world. Martha slowly placed the shirt and her sewing kit on the porch swing. She stood, her body taut, every nerve ending tingling with an alarm she hadn't felt since the day the doctor had shaken his head over Elias's sweat-soaked body. She scanned the property. Nothing seemed out of place. The chickens scratched in their dusty coop. Her old mare, Bessie, swished her tail lazily in the corral. The landscape was empty, stretching out into an infinity of brown and pale green under the immense, indifferent blue sky. The cough came again, closer this time. It was a man's cough, deep and racked, with a pain that seemed to tear at the very air. It was followed by a low groan. Martha's first instinct was pure, unadulterated fear. A drifter, a bandit, an outlaw seeking refuge. The territory was rife with them. A lone woman and a small boy were the easiest of prey. Her gaze darted to the house, where Elias's old Remington shotgun hung above the mantelpiece. It was loaded. She had made sure of that every single morning since his funeral. But then another instinct, one buried deeper, stirred within her. It was the memory of Elias's cough, the way it had started as a tickle and grown into a monster that shook the bed frame and left him gasping, his face pale and clammy. She remembered the helplessness, the desperate prayers that went unanswered. The man behind the barn sounded just as desperate. She took a step off the porch, her worn leather boots making no sound in the thick dust. "Caleb," she called, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Come inside now. Time for a drink of water." He grumbled a protest, but obeyed his loyalty to his mother absolute. As soon as he was safely in the kitchen, a glass of well water in his hand, Martha slipped back out the front door, circling around the house to approach the barn from the side. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to live in harmony with a dangerous land, staying close to the wall, her shadow, a long, thin spear in the afternoon sun. The smell of horse manure and hay grew stronger as she neared the corner. She could hear ragged breathing, now punctuated by another gut-wrenching cough. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she peered around the edge of the weathered timber. He was lying in the narrow sliver of shade cast by the barn's overhang. He was Navajo. That was her first thought, seeing the dark, weathered skin, the high cheekbones, and the long, graying black hair tied back with a simple leather thong. He was old, perhaps 60 winters or more, and his face was a roadmap of a hard life, etched with deep lines of pain and exhaustion. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a torn calico shirt that was dark with sweat and something else, blood. A dark, ugly stain was spreading from a wound high on his shoulder. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored jerks. An empty canteen lay on its side near his outstretched hand. He wasn't a threat. Not anymore. He looked like he was dying. As she watched, his eyes fluttered open. They were black and piercing, but clouded with fever and pain. They found her, and for a long moment, they just stared. There was no aggression in his gaze, only a profound, bottomless weariness. He tried to push himself up to say something, but the effort sent another volley of coughs through his frail body. When it subsided, he sank back against the wall, his head lolling to the side. Martha stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of conflict. The townspeople of Redemption Gulch were not kind to the Navajo. They called them savages, thieves, heathens. Sheriff Brody Thorne had made it his personal crusade to drive the last of the local clans from the nearby hills, claiming their presence was a danger to decent God-fearing folk. Just last month, a Navajo man had been accused of stealing a horse and was hanged without a trial. To help this man was to invite the wrath of the entire town upon her and Caleb. They could call her an accomplice, a sympathizer. They could take her farm. They could take her son. But to leave him here was to condemn him to death. The sun would soon shift, leaving him exposed to its brutal baking glare. The buzzards were already circling high overhead, patient and knowing. She looked at his face, at the lines of suffering around his eyes, and she didn't see a savage. She saw a man in agony. She saw Elias. She thought of Dr. Olcott, the town physician, with his soft hands and his expensive, useless medicines that had done nothing for her husband. She thought of the townsfolk who had offered their condolences with one hand and whispered about how a lone woman couldn't possibly manage a farm with the other. They were not her protectors. They were her judges. The Navajo man's eyes closed again. A faint, raspy whisper escaped his lips. Water. The word cut through her fear and indecision. It was the same word Elias had whispered in his final hours. With her jaw set in grim resolve, Martha Hemlock made her choice. She walked out from behind the corner of the barn, her shadow falling over the dying man. He was her secret now, her burden, her rebellion. Getting the man inside the barn was a feat of strength Martha didn't know she possessed. He was surprisingly light, a man of sinew and bone, hollowed out by injury and dehydration, but his dead weight was still a challenge for her own lean frame. She half dragged, half carried him, his arm slung over her shoulder, his worn moccasins scuffing a pathetic trail through the dust. He groaned with every jolt, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. The barn's interior was a cathedral of heat and shadow, smelling of decades of hay sweat and livestock. Dust motes danced like tiny angels in the shafts of light piercing through the cracks in the roof. Martha guided him to an empty stall in the back, one filled with clean, dry hay. She eased him down his body, slumping onto the soft pile with a sigh of relief that was more pain than comfort. "Caleb!" She called, her voice sharp, echoing in the cavernous space. "Stay in the house. Lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you." She heard the click of the latch on the house door and allowed herself a small measure of relief. One danger was contained, at least for now. She returned to the stall with a bucket of fresh water and a strip of clean linen she'd torn from an old bedsheet. The man's eyes were open again, watching her with a cautious, intelligent focus that belied his physical state. "I mean you no harm," Martha said, her voice low and even. It felt important to say it, to bridge the chasm of fear and prejudice that separated their two worlds. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He pointed a trembling finger toward his shoulder. The wound was worse than she'd thought. A bullet had torn through the flesh, leaving a ragged, angry hole. It was inflamed the skin around it, a violent red, and it smelled of sickness. It hadn't been cleaned. Whoever shot him had left him for dead. "Who did this?" she asked, dipping the linen into the water. The man flinched as she began to gently clean the wound, but he didn't cry out. His jaw tightened, and a sheen of sweat broke out on his brow. After a long moment, his voice came raspy and thin. "Sheriff's men. They say I am a poacher, a thief." Sheriff Thorne. The name landed like a stone in Martha's gut. This was worse than a simple drifter. This was a wanted man, a fugitive. "Were you?" She asked, her hands not ceasing their work. He closed his eyes. "I was gathering herbs, on the ridge, for my people. The sickness is among them." He coughed a dry, rattling sound that shook his entire body. "The land belongs to the Great Spirit, not the white man's fences." His words resonated with a simple, profound truth that Martha understood. Elias had felt the same way, always chafing at the deeds and property lines that carved up the open range. She finished cleaning the wound as best she could. It needed more than water and linen. It needed stitching, and it needed medicine. The kind Dr. Alcott didn't have. The kind that grew wild on the land if you knew where to look. "You need to drink," she said, holding the dipper to his lips. He drank greedily, the cool water spilling down his chin. When he was done, he lay back, his breathing already a little easier. "My name is Martha," she offered, not knowing why. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her to the core of her grief and her loneliness. "I am called Hastian Yazzie," he said. His voice was gaining a little of its strength. "It means little man, a name from my youth." "You rest, Hastian Yazzie," she said, pulling a coarse wool blanket over him. "No one will find you here." She hoped it was a promise she could keep. For the next 2 days, Martha lived a double life. To Caleb, she was the same mother she had always been, though perhaps a little more distracted, her eyes straying often toward the barn. They did their chores, ate their simple meals, and read from the family Bible by lamplight in the evenings. But every few hours she would find an excuse to check on Bessie, to gather eggs, to fetch a tool and slip into the barn. She brought Yazzie water and broth she made from one of her scrawnier chickens. He was a patient, never complaining his stoicism, a stark contrast to Elias's fretful suffering. She found a poultice of yarrow in her own small collection of folk remedies and applied it to his wound. It seemed to help reducing the angry swelling. They spoke little, but a strange understanding grew in the shared silence of the dusty barn. He would watch her with those intelligent, assessing eyes. She found herself talking to him, filling the quiet not with questions about his pursuers, but with stories about Elias, about her struggles with the farm, about her fears for Caleb. He was a silent confessor, a repository for the worries she could share with no one else. On the third day, he was strong enough to sit up. He looked at the festering wound on his shoulder with a clinical detachment. "This is white man's sickness," he said, his voice stronger now. "The iron poison. It needs the earth's medicine." "I have yarrow," she said. He shook his head. "Yarrow is good, but not enough. There is a root. The old ones call it fever ender. It grows near the creek where the shade is deep." He described the plant to her broad, dark green leaves, a small, unassuming purple flower, and a thick, gnarled root that smelled of damp soil and rain. Martha knew the place he meant, a small, shaded tributary of Coyote Creek, a place she sometimes went to escape the midday sun. "The sheriff will be looking for you," she warned. "His men will be scouring the whole territory." "They look for a man who runs," Yazzie said. "They do not look for a woman gathering plants by a creek." He was right. It was a risk, but leaving the wound to fester was a greater one. Leaving him in her barn was the greatest risk of all, and she had already taken that one. The next morning, she packed a small basket with a trowel and some cloth. She told Caleb she was going to look for wild berries. "Can I come?" he asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "No, sweet boy," she said, kneeling to kiss his forehead. "You stay here and look after the farm. Be my big man. I won't be long." The walk to the creek was tense. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every hawk's cry like a shout. The sun beat down, and the air was thick with the scent of sage and dust. She clutched the basket handle, her knuckles white. She was no longer just a widow surviving on the edge of civilization. She was a conspirator, an accomplice to a fugitive. She was breaking the law Sheriff Thorne's law, the white man's law, to save a man she barely knew. And with every step she took toward that creek, she felt a strange sense of liberation, a shedding of the meek and grieving woman she had been. She was doing something. She was not helpless. For the first time since Elias died, she was fighting back against the cruel indifference of the world. A week after she'd found Hastin Yazzie behind her barn, Martha knew she couldn't put it off any longer. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee tin held only a few precious beans, and Caleb was complaining about eating nothing but cornmeal and potatoes. She had to go into town. The thought filled her with a cold, creeping dread. Redemption. Gulch had never felt like a welcoming place, but now it felt like enemy territory. Every face would be a potential accuser, every question a potential trap. She left before dawn, while the sky was still a bruised purple and the air held a sliver of coolness. She gave Yazzie, who was now able to walk slowly around the barn, a fresh bucket of water and the last of her bread. His shoulder was healing. The poultice from the fever ender root had worked a quiet magic, drawing out the infection and closing the wound. The fever had broken, and the clarity had returned to his eyes. "Be watchful," he told her, his voice a low rumble. Fear makes them blind and deaf to reason. She hitched Bessie to the small buckboard wagon, placing Caleb on the seat beside her. The 2-mile journey felt like 100. The familiar ruts of the track seemed menacing, the landscape accusatory. Caleb, sensing her tension, was uncharacteristically quiet, his small hand occasionally reaching out to touch her arm, as if for reassurance. Redemption. Gulch was a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a smithy, a sheriff's office, and a church whose steeple seemed to stab at the sky. As she pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Miller's general store, the town seemed different. There was a current of agitation running beneath the surface, a nervous energy in the way people moved and spoke. Groups of men stood clustered on the boardwalk, their voices low and angry. Martha tied Bessie to the hitching post, her hands fumbling with the knot. "Stay here, Caleb. Don't talk to anyone." Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of leather tobacco and coffee. Mrs. Miller, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched with disapproval, was holding court behind the counter. "Took another one last night," she was saying to a pair of ranchers. "Little Lily, the sheriff's own daughter. Burning up with the dust fever, they say. Dr. Alcott is beside himself." "It's that Navajo devil." One of the ranchers, a burly man named Gus, spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "He's put a curse on this town. Ever since Thorne ran him off, this sickness has been getting worse. Sheriff's offering a reward now," the other man added. $50. For the old one they call Yazzie. $50 for him, dead or alive. Martha's blood ran cold. $50. In this part of the country, that was a fortune. It was enough to make a man's closest friend turn against him. It was enough to make people search every barn, every shed, every shadowed ravine in a 100-mile radius. She forced herself to walk calmly to the counter, her shopping list clutched in her hand. Mrs. Miller turned her sour gaze on her. "Martha, haven't seen you in a while. Been busy on the farm?" Martha said, her voice sounding thin and foreign to her own ears. "I need flour, coffee salt, and some horehound candy for my boy." Mrs. Miller began to measure out the flour, her movements sharp and efficient. "You'd best be careful out there on your own. The sheriff says that Navajo is wounded. He'll be desperate, likely to kill a lone woman for a crust of bread." "I keep my shotgun loaded," Martha replied, meeting the woman's gaze. It was a struggle to keep her expression neutral, to betray none of the terror that was clawing at her insides. As she was paying, the door to the store swung open, and Sheriff Brody Thorne himself stepped inside. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a thick mustache and pale, unforgiving eyes. His face was etched with exhaustion and worry, the lines around his eyes deeper than Martha remembered. The badge on his chest seemed to mock the powerlessness he so clearly felt. Behind him stood Silas Blackwood, a land speculator, from back east, always dressed in a fine black suit that seemed to repel the dust of the West. Blackwood had his eye on the lands the Navajo had been forced from, and he fanned the flames of the town's fear at every opportunity. "Morning, Mrs. Hemlock?" Thorne said, his voice gravelly. He nodded curtly, but his eyes swept over her, sharp and assessing. "You seen anything unusual out your way? Any strangers' tracks?" "No, Sheriff," Martha said, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Just the usual. Coyotes and jackrabbits." "It wasn't coyotes that put this sickness on us," Blackwood said smoothly, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "It's heathen magic. The sooner we hunt down that medicine man and make an example of him, the sooner this town can heal." Thorne didn't respond. He just stared at Martha, his gaze intense. "My Lily is sick," he said, the words raw with a father's pain. "If you hear anything, Anything at all. You send word. That $50 could be a big help to a widow woman." The veiled threat wrapped in a supposed offer of help was unmistakable. He knew she was struggling. He was testing her, tempting her. "I'll be sure to do that, Sheriff," she said, gathering her purchases. She grabbed Caleb's hand and practically fled the store, not daring to look back. The ride home was a blur of fear. Every word spoken in the store echoed in her mind. A curse. $50. Dead or alive. My Lily is sick. The sheriff's personal desperation made him infinitely more dangerous. A man enforcing the law was one thing. A father fighting for his child's life was another. He would tear the whole territory apart to find a cure or a scapegoat. When she finally saw the familiar shape of her house and barn on the horizon, she didn't feel relief but a fresh wave of panic. Her isolated homestead no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. The secret she was keeping in her barn was no longer just a man. He was a $50 bounty, a symbol of the town's hatred and the focus of a desperate father's hunt. And he was living under her roof. The whispers from Redemption Gulch were following her home, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they became a roar. When Martha returned to the farm, the sun was high and merciless. She unloaded the supplies with frantic energy, her mind still reeling from the venomous atmosphere in town. Caleb, sensing her distress, stayed close, his small face clouded with a worry that broke her heart. After settling him in the house with the precious bag of horehound candy, she went to the barn. Hostian Yazzie was sitting in the shadows of the stall, his back against the wall. He had been using a piece of charcoal to draw symbols on a smooth plank of wood. He looked up as she entered, and his dark eyes immediately registered the fear on her face. "The town is sick," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she recounted the conversations from the store. "They call it the dust fever. They blame you. They say you put a curse on them. The sheriff's own daughter. She has it." Yazzie listened without interruption, his expression grim but unsurprised. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, studying the symbols he had drawn. "They are fools," he said at last, his voice heavy with a sorrow that went deeper than anger. "They curse themselves and blame the spirits of my people." "What do you mean?" Martha asked, sinking onto a nearby hay bale, the weight of her deception pressing down on her. "Dust fever." He scoffed softly. "They give it a name to make it a monster they can fight. It is not a curse. It is in the water." Martha stared at him. "The water? What are you talking about? The well in town is the deepest and coldest in the county. Everyone says so. Deep and cold does not mean clean," Yazzie explained, his gaze steady and intense. "This sickness, I have seen it before, many winters ago in my own village. It began the same way. A cough, then, a fever that burns from the inside out. The children and the elders are the first to fall." He spoke with a chilling authority, the voice of one who had witnessed immense suffering. "It comes from the droppings of bats," he continued. "When a long, dry season comes, as it has this summer, the water level in the wells and creeks goes down. The bat guano, which lies deep in the earth in the caves where the water flows, gets into the wells. It is a poison, a slow poison." Martha's mind struggled to comprehend it. Bat droppings. It sounded like nonsense, like the very heathen magic Silas Blackwood had accused him of. And yet, it made a terrifying kind of sense. The sickness had started slowly, a few isolated cases, but had spread rapidly as the summer wore on, and the drought worsened. Everyone in Redemption Gulch drank from the town well. "My own well," she whispered, her blood turning to ice. Caleb and I— Your well is shallow, Yazzie said, anticipating her fear. It is fed by the rain and the surface water. The town well draws from the deep springs that run through the caves in the hills. You are safe. For now. A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over Martha. But it was immediately followed by a fresh horror. The people in town, the children, Lily Thorne— they were all slowly poisoning themselves with every cup of water they drank. "Why didn't you tell them?" she demanded, a hint of accusation in her voice. "If you knew why, didn't you warn them?" Yazzie looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of deep, raw pain in his eyes. "Tell them, the white men with rifles who shot me for gathering plants. The sheriff who calls my people vermin. They would have laughed, and then they would have hanged me. They do not want my knowledge. They want my blood." He was right. Martha felt a flush of shame. Of course he was right. They wouldn't have listened. They would have seen his warning as a threat, a confirmation of his curse. "The herbs I was gathering." Yazzie went on, his voice regaining its calm, instructional tone. "One was the fever ender root you brought me. It fights the burning in the body. But there are two others. A green-leafed plant that cleanses the blood of the poison, and a bitter bark that soothes the lungs. Together, they can stop the sickness, if it is not too late." He described the other two plants in detail, the blood-cleansing herb with its star-shaped yellow flower, and the tree with the smooth grey bark that peeled in thin strips. He knew the land with an intimacy that Martha, for all her years of farming, it could not match. He didn't see property lines or deeds. He saw a living pharmacy, a complex web of life and remedy. "And Dr. Alcott?" Martha asked quietly. "His medicines?" Yazzie shook his head. "His medicine is for a different world. He fights the symptoms. He does not see the cause. He tries to shout down the thunder, but he does not see the storm cloud on the horizon." A new and terrible choice began to form in Martha's mind. It was one thing to hide a fugitive from a posse. It was another thing entirely to hold the knowledge that could save a town that wanted you and your charge dead. What was she supposed to do? March into Redemption Gulch and announce that the savage they were hunting held the cure to their plague? They'd think she was mad. Or worse, his accomplice in witchcraft. That evening, as she tucked Caleb into his bed, she watched him sleep, his face peaceful in the soft lamplight. She brushed the stray hairs from his forehead, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. He was safe because their well was shallow. But what if it wasn't? What if Yazzie was wrong? Then Caleb coughed. It was a small, dry sound in the quiet room, a sound any child might make. But to Martha, in that moment, it was the crack of doom. She froze her hand, hovering over his chest. He coughed again, a little stronger this time, a tickle of dust in his throat. She rushed to the water bucket in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she filled a dipper. She tasted it. It was the same water they had been drinking for years, cool and clean. It couldn't be. But then she remembered. 2 days ago, before she had gone to town, Caleb had been playing near the corral. He'd come in thirsty, gulping down water, but he had been gone for a long time. Long enough to wander. Long enough, perhaps, to wander down toward Coyote Creek, which was fed by the same deep springs that supplied the town. He sometimes followed the creek looking for tadpoles and shiny rocks. Had he drunk from it, she ran back to his bedside. His forehead, when she pressed her palm against it, felt warm. Warmer than usual. It was probably nothing. A child's summer sickness. But the healer's knowledge, once planted, had taken root in her mind, and it was growing into a tree of pure terror. The town's plague was no longer an abstract problem. It was a monster scratching at her own door. By morning, there was no denying it. Caleb was sick. The warmth of the previous night had bloomed into a full-blown fever. He lay listless in his small bed, his skin hot and dry to the touch, his eyes glassy and unfocused. The small dry cough had deepened into a harsh, ragged bark that seemed to tear at his little chest. He pushed away the broth she offered him, complaining of a thirst that no amount of water could seem to quench. It was the dust fever. Martha knew it with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a tombstone. The monster had crossed her threshold. Panic, sharp and blinding, seized her. Her first desperate thought was of Dr. Alcott. Despite Yazzy's dismissal, the doctor represented the established order, the civilized help she was supposed to seek. She could bundle Caleb into the buckboard and race to town, but the image of the doctor's soft, useless hands as he tended to Elias filled her with a profound sense of futility. He would offer laudanum to help Caleb sleep, perhaps a cool compress for his head. He would speak in reassuring, condescending tones while the sickness raged unchecked inside her son. And what would she say when he asked where Caleb might have contracted the fever? Admitting he'd been near Coyote Creek would invite questions she couldn't answer. Her second thought was of Yazzie. He was in the barn, a font of ancient knowledge, the only person who seemed to understand what was happening. But he was a fugitive. Bringing her sick child to him, placing her faith in his roots and barks, was an act of ultimate rebellion. It was turning her back completely on the world she knew and placing her son's life in the hands of a man the world wanted to kill. The choice, when it came, was no choice at all. She looked at Caleb's flushed face, heard the labored rasp of his breathing, and knew she would trust the man who spoke of causes over the one who only treated symptoms. She carried Caleb wrapped in a thick blanket, despite the heat to the barn. He was a frail, warm weight in her arms. Hastin Yazzie was waiting as if he had known she would come. He looked at the boy, his weathered face solemn, and gently placed a hand on Caleb's forehead. "The poison is in him," he said, his voice soft. "But he is strong. His spirit is a fighter." He had Martha lay Caleb on the clean hay, where he himself had recovered. For the next hour he worked with a quiet, focused intensity. He took the fever-ender root she had gathered and crushed it into a paste with a smooth stone. He examined the boy's tongue and the whites of his eyes. He listened to his breathing, his ear pressed against Caleb's small back. "The fever is the body's battle," he explained to Martha, his voice calm and steady, a balm to her frayed nerves. "We must help the body win, not silence the battle cries." He mixed the root paste with water and coaxed a few spoonfuls between Caleb's cracked lips. "This will fight the heat," he said, "but we need the other plants, the blood cleaner and the lung soother. We need them now." Martha's heart sank. "But where you said they were dangerous to get." "The star-flowered one grows on the sunny slopes of the West Ridge," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "The peeling bark tree is in the shaded grove by Coyote Creek, beyond where you found the root. I can get them." "No," Martha said instantly. "You can't. They're hunting for you. A $50 bounty. You wouldn't make it a mile." "And you cannot leave the boy," he countered. "He cannot be left alone." They were trapped. The cure was out there on the land, but it might as well have been on the moon. Every passing hour, Caleb's fever seemed to climb higher. Meanwhile, in Redemption, Gulch, a different kind of fever was raging. Sheriff Brody Thorne stood on the porch of his small house, listening to the shallow, rapid breathing of his 5-year-old daughter, Lily. Dr. Alcott had just left his bag of tinctures and powders, providing no relief. He had shaken his head, mumbled something about the fever running its course, and fled to the house, unable to meet the sheriff's desperate gaze. Thorne felt a rage building inside him, a white-hot fury at his own impotence. He was the law in this county. He could face down outlaws, settle disputes with the threat of the gun on his hip, and maintain a fragile order through sheer force of will. But he couldn't fight this invisible enemy that was stealing the life from his only child. Silas Blackwood found him there, leaning against the porch railing. "No change, I take it," Blackwood said, his voice oozing a practiced sympathy. "She's worse," Thorne bit out, not looking at him. This all started when that Navajo medicine man trespassed on settler land, Blackwood said, lighting a thin cigar. "He stirred up the old spirits, brought this plague down on us as revenge. I've seen it before. Their magic is powerful, Sheriff. Evil." Thorne didn't believe in curses, not really. But Blackwood's words found fertile ground in his fear and desperation. He needed an enemy he could see, a foe he could fight. The Navajo was that foe. The idea that Yazzie was out there free while his daughter lay dying was an unbearable insult. "I've doubled the bounty," Thorne announced, his voice hard as iron. $100. I want every man who can ride and shoot to be a part of the posse. We're going to sweep the territory grid by grid. We'll check every homestead, every canyon, every cave. We're going to find him." "That's the spirit, Sheriff," Blackwood said with a satisfied smile. "Show them what happens when they cross us." Thorne strode toward his office, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. He was no longer just a lawman. He was a hunter. He was a father, pushed to the brink, his grief and fear forged into a single sharp point of vengeful purpose. He would find Hustin Yazzie. He would make him lift the curse, or he would put a bullet in him and watch the life drain from his eyes. One way or another the hunt was on, and it would not end until he had his man. The territory was about to become a very dangerous place for anyone hiding a secret. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. Inside the barn, the air was suffocatingly hot. Caleb's breathing was a shallow, rattling sound that was the only measure of time for Martha. He was slipping away. She could feel it. His fevered skin was clammy, and he no longer responded to her voice. Hustin Yazzie sat beside the boy, his face a mask of concentration. He had done all he could with the single route. It was not enough. "There is no choice," Yazzie said, his voice quiet but firm as he looked up at Martha. "The plants must be gathered tonight, under the moon. It is our only chance." "We can't," Martha whispered, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "The posse. The sheriff doubled the bounty. They'll be everywhere." "They will be loud," Yazzie countered. "They will ride in packs, thinking their numbers give them strength. But a single shadow moving with purpose can pass unseen. I will go." "No," Martha said, her voice finding a sudden strength. "You don't know the land around here as I do. Not the back ways, the little gullies. And your shoulder is still weak. You can't ride fast if you're seen." She stood up, her decision crystallizing in the crucible of her fear. "We both go." Yazzie looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "And the boy?" "We take him with us," she declared. The idea was insane, but it was the only one she had. "I can make a sling, keep him bundled to my chest while I ride Bessie. It's better than leaving him here to die alone while we're gone. If we're caught, we're all caught together." It was a desperate, foolish plan born of a mother's fierce love and a healer's grim necessity. Yazzie saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes and gave a slow, solemn nod. "The moon is almost full. It will give us light." An hour later, they were ready. Martha had fashioned a sling from a heavy wool blanket, securing Caleb to her chest. He was a hot limp weight against her, his small puffs of breath ghosting against her neck. Yazzie had packed a small leather pouch with his charcoal, the fever-ender root, and a knife. He would ride bareback on the old mule, an animal too slow and placid to draw attention. Martha saddled Bessie, her movements swift and silent in the darkness. They slipped out of the barn like ghosts, moving into the vast, moon-drenched landscape. The prairie, so harsh and unforgiving by day, was transformed into a place of ethereal beauty and deep, menacing shadows. Every coyote's howl sounded like a warning, every rustle in the sagebrush like the approach of the posse. They rode west toward the ridge Yazzie had described. He led the way, his eyes scanning the terrain, reading the contours of the land in the silvery light. Martha followed her body, aching with the tension of her ride, one hand constantly on Caleb's back, as if she could will her own strength into his failing body. They found the star-flowered herb on a rocky slope, its small yellow blossoms glowing faintly in the moonlight. Yazzie dismounted and gathered a handful, his movements economical and precise, wasting no time. He crushed a leaf between his fingers and gave it to Martha. The scent was clean and sharp. "The blood cleaner," he said, placing the precious herbs in his pouch. From the top of the ridge they could see them, torches, a line of moving lights like angry fireflies sweeping across the valley floor below. The posse. They were at least 2 miles away, moving systematically from the east, moving toward her farm. A cold dread washed over Martha. "They're going to find the house empty," she breathed. "They'll know. They will think you have fled to town for safety," Yazzie said calmly, though his eyes were fixed on the lights. "We must hurry. The creek is on the other side of this ridge." They began their descent, a treacherous journey down a steep, shale-covered slope. The horses slipped and scrambled for footing. A dislodged rock went skittering down into the darkness, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Far below, one of the torches seemed to waver and stop. "They heard it," Martha whispered, her heart hammering. "Move!" Yazzie commanded, his voice sharp. They reached the bottom of the ridge and urged their mounts into a grove of cottonwoods, plunging into deep shadow. They waited, their breath held, as the minutes stretched into an eternity. They could hear faint shouts now carried on the night wind. The line of torches had broken, with 2 or 3 of them starting to move up the slope they had just descended. Sheriff Thorne urged his horse up the rocky incline, his eyes straining in the flickering torchlight. "Did you hear that?" he called to the men behind him. "Probably just a rock fall." "Sheriff," one of them answered, his voice betraying his weariness. "Or a cougar." "Maybe," Thorne said, but his gut told him otherwise. He was close. He could feel it. The desperation to save Lily made him preternaturally alert to every sound, every shadow. He scanned the dark line of trees at the bottom of the slope. A perfect place to hide. "You two swing wide and come up the creek bed. The rest of you with me. Spread out. I want to see anything that moves." Inside the cottonwood grove, Martha and Yazzie were trapped. The posse was closing in from 2 directions. Coyote Creek was just ahead, but to get to it they would have to break cover. Caleb chose that moment to stir, letting out a low, fevered moan. The sound was horribly clear in the silent grove. Yazzie put a hand on Martha's arm, his touch firm and grounding. He pointed toward a dense thicket of willows near the creek bank. "There," he whispered. "Dismount. Lead the animals. Do not run." They slid off their mounts and, keeping low, led the horse and mule into the willows. The branches clawed at their faces and clothes. They pushed deeper until they were completely enveloped in the darkness of the thicket, the smell of damp earth and crushed leaves filling their nostrils. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Martha pressed Caleb tighter against her, covering his mouth with her hand, praying he would stay quiet. She could see the torchlight now dancing through the leaves, casting grotesque leaping shadows all around them. Men were shouting, calling out to one another. "See anything?" "Nothing over here, Sheriff." A rider passed so close that Martha could smell the sweat of his horse. She could see the grim, determined set of his jaw in the torchlight. She squeezed her eyes shut, her entire being focused on a single silent prayer. For what felt like a lifetime, the posse searched the grove. Hoofbeats churned the soft earth just yards from their hiding place. Finally, Sheriff Thorne's voice cut through the tension. "Nothing. Damn it. It was probably just a cougar after all. Let's head back to the main party. We'll check the hemlock place at first light." Slowly the sounds of the posse faded into the distance. Martha didn't move until the last flicker of torchlight had disappeared, and the only sound was the chirping of crickets and the gurgle of the nearby creek. She was shaking, uncontrollably drenched in a cold sweat. Yazzie touched her shoulder. "They are gone, but they will be back." They had to find the bark, and they had to do it now. They emerged from the willows, their hearts still pounding, and found the grove of smooth-barked trees just a few yards up the creek. Yazzie used his knife to carefully peel away strips of the bark, his movements once again filled with a reverent purpose. He had all three ingredients. The gamble had paid off. But as they mounted their animals to begin the perilous journey home, they both knew the clock was ticking. "First light," Sheriff Thorne had said. They had only a few hours to administer the medicine and pray for a miracle before the full force of the law descended on Martha Hemlock's farm. The race against the dawn was a desperate, silent affair. They reached the farm as the sky bled from black to grey, the air cool and smelling of dust and dew. Inside the barn, the lamplight cast an urgent glow. Yazzie worked with silent haste, crushing the root leaves and bark into a dark, fragrant mash, the air filled with the potent scent of the earth as he carefully administered the medicine to the barely conscious Caleb. They had just laid a poultice on the boy's chest when the thunder of a dozen horses shook the yard. The barn door flew open, framing Sheriff Thorne against the blinding sunrise, his shotgun leveled. Behind him stood the grim faces of the posse. His eyes landed on the scene, Martha kneeling defiantly beside her son and the old Navajo man standing over them. "So," Thorne's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "You've been harboring him, Mrs. Hemlock, aiding a murderer." "He is not a murderer," Martha cried, rising to her feet to shield them both. "He's a healer. My son has the dust fever, same as your Lily." Silas Blackwood sneered from behind the sheriff. "Sick because of him. He's poisoned the boy with his devil magic end, this sheriff." "You are all blind with fear." Martha's voice rang out, cutting through the murmurs. "The sickness isn't a curse. It's the water. The town well is poisoned." A ripple of disbelief went through the men. As Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger, a small sound broke the tense standoff. A cough. It wasn't the dry, hacking sound of the fever. It was wet and productive. Caleb stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He coughed again, more strongly, and a wave of heat seemed to recede from his small body. The men stared, their mouths agape. They had all seen what the fever did. It did not simply break. What they were witnessing felt like a miracle. Yazzie finally spoke, his voice calm and resonant in the heavy silence. "Your children are dying because you drink poisoned water. You have been fighting the wrong enemy." He held up the pouch with the remaining herbs. "The cure is not in a gun. It is in the earth." Sheriff Thorne stared from the recovering Caleb to the serene face of the old healer. The iron certainty that had driven him for days was fracturing, cracking apart, to reveal the raw, desperate father underneath. His daughter was fading. This boy was living. To trust this man was to betray his own rigid law, yet not to trust him might be to condemn his own child. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the shotgun. The click of the safety being engaged was deafening. "My daughter," Thorn said the words, catching in his throat, stripped of all authority, all menace. They were just the plea of a terrified father. "Can you help her?" Yazzie looked at the man who had hunted him, and saw not an enemy, but another human in pain. He gave a single, solemn nod. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was one of stunned silence. Yazzie, no longer a fugitive, worked his quiet magic in the sheriff's home, and by sunset, Lily Thorn's fever had also broken. The town, humbled and shaken, abandoned its poisoned well. Silas Blackwood, his schemes undone, vanished with the morning mist. A true peace would take seasons to grow, but on that day, a bridge was built between two worlds, not with laws or guns, but by a mother's courage and a healer's wisdom. The story of Martha Hemlock and Hustin Yazzie isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's a story about what happens when we choose compassion over fear and listening over judgment. Martha, a woman with every reason to be afraid, opened her heart to a stranger, and in doing so discovered a truth that saved not only his life, but the lives of the very people who condemned him. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest wisdom is found in the most unlikely places, and the most dangerous poison isn't in the water, but in the hatred we allow to fester in our own hearts. It's a testament to the fact that one person's courage can change the destiny of many. If this story of courage and an unlikely alliance moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of quiet strength and hidden truths. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Martha's journey resonated with you the most? Thanks for listening.